The champagne glass slipped from my fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the Morrison & Associates ballroom, sending crystal fragments across expensive Italian shoes and designer dresses. But nobody noticed the mess I'd made because they were all staring at something far more shocking. Anthony Mason, the billionaire CEO of one of Portland's most prestigious investment firms, was asking me for my autograph. Not my brother Tyler, the hotshot finance executive in his $1,000 suit. Not any of the other corporate powerhouses mingling at this exclusive holiday party. Me. Sienna Walsh. The delusional dreamer, with the dead-end hobby, who Tyler had just finished humiliating in front of his entire professional network. Miss Walsh, I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to finally meet you in person, Anthony Mason said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd like a thunderclap. He was holding a first-edition copy of The Chronicles of Valdres, my fantasy, a novel that wasn't supposed to exist yet, that hadn't even been officially announced to the public. I've been following your work online for months. Your world-building is absolutely extraordinary, and the character development in your trilogy is some of the finest fantasy literature I've encountered in decades. Just 10 minutes earlier, Tyler had been holding court near the appetizer table, regaling his colleagues with stories about his eccentric little sister who lived in what he called a fantasy world of her own making. He'd laughed that cruel laugh I'd grown to dread, the one that made me feel like I was still the awkward teenager who spent lunch breaks in the library writing stories while he starred on the varsity football team. Sienna's been working on this book for years. Tyler had announced to anyone within earshot, making air quotes with his manicured fingers. She actually thinks someone's going to pay her to write about dragons and magic kingdoms. I keep telling her she needs to get a real job, maybe something in marketing or teaching, but she's convinced she's going to be the next J.K. Rowling. The group had chuckled politely, the kind of forced laughter that happens when someone's boss is telling a story they're expected to find amusing. I'd stood there in my thrift store dress, the nicest thing I owned that didn't have coffee stains or holes from my 3 part-time jobs, feeling my face burn with embarrassment as Tyler continued his performance. Don't get me wrong, I love my sister, but someone needs to give her a reality check. She's 28 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, working at a coffee shop, and doing freelance editing just to afford her little writing hobby. It's time to grow up and join the real world. What Tyler didn't know, what nobody in that room except me knew, was that 4 hours earlier, my phone had buzzed with a call that changed everything. Lisa Johnson, my literary agent in New York, had delivered news that still felt like a dream. Sienna, sit down. Penguin Random House wants your trilogy. They're offering a 3-book deal with a $200,000 advance, and they want a fast-track publication for next spring. I'd been sitting in my tiny studio apartment in Southeast Portland, surrounded by rejection letters and empty ramen containers, when Lisa's call transformed my entire universe in the span of a 5-minute conversation. The same manuscript that Tyler had been mocking for years, the story that had consumed my nights and weekends for the past 4 years, was about to become a published novel with one of the biggest publishers in the world. But I hadn't told anyone yet. Not my parents, not my few close friends, and certainly not Tyler. Some instinct had held me back from sharing the news, maybe because I'd grown so accustomed to his dismissive reactions that I wanted to savor this victory privately before subjecting it to his inevitable criticism. Now, standing in this opulent ballroom, watching Anthony Mason praise my work while Tyler's mouth hung open in shock, I realized that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about timing. Sometimes the moment when you feel most defeated is actually the moment right before everything changes. And sometimes the people who mock your dreams the loudest are the ones who need to learn the hardest lessons about underestimating others. The crowd was pressing closer now, trying to understand how the CEO of a major investment firm knew about my unpublished novel, while Tyler stood frozen in place, still processing the fact that his delusional sister was apparently someone worth knowing. Growing up in the Walsh household meant living in Tyler's shadow from the moment I could walk. He was 4 years older, naturally athletic, academically gifted, and possessed the kind of effortless charm that made teachers love him and classmates want to be his friend. I was the quiet one with thick glasses and a backpack full of library books, always scribbling in notebooks during family dinners, while Tyler regaled our parents with stories of his latest achievements. Our childhood in suburban Seattle had been comfortable but competitive, with parents who meant well but unconsciously reinforced the dynamic that Tyler was the golden child destined for greatness, while I was the artistic dreamer who needed constant reality checks. Dad, a practical accountant, would beam with pride when Tyler brought home reports of his business club victories or debate team championships. When I won the middle school creative writing contest, Dad's response was, "That's nice, honey, but make sure you're keeping up with your math homework too." The disparity became more pronounced as we entered adulthood. Tyler sailed through business school at the University of Washington, landed a prestigious internship at Morrison & Associates, and climbed the corporate ladder with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything else in his life. By 32, he was a senior financial analyst pulling in a six-figure salary, driving a BMW, and living in a Pearl District condo that cost more than most people's houses. Meanwhile, I'd taken the path that made family gatherings uncomfortable and phone calls with Tyler feel like interventions. After graduating from Portland State with an English degree that everyone agreed was impractical, I'd cobbled together a survival-level existence that revolved around my writing. My days started at 5 a.m. at Grind Coffee, a quirky independent shop in the Hawthorne district where I served lattes to hipsters and tech workers while mentally plotting the next chapter of my fantasy trilogy. Afternoons were spent freelance editing other people's manuscripts for $20 an hour, a work that paid the bills, but left me emotionally drained from fixing other writers' stories when I desperately wanted to focus on my own. Evenings belonged to my real passion, the world of Valdris, a fantasy realm I'd been building since college, complete with detailed maps, languages, political systems, and characters who felt more real to me than most of the people in my actual life. The contrast between Tyler's lifestyle and mine had become a source of constant tension during family visits. While he talked about client acquisitions and investment portfolios, I deflected questions about my career plans and tried to explain why I believed in my writing without sounding defensive or delusional. Tyler had appointed himself as my unofficial life coach, regularly sending me job listings for marketing positions or suggesting I consider going back to school for something more stable. "Sienna, I'm worried about you," had become his standard opening line during our monthly phone calls. "You're talented, you're smart, but you're wasting your 20s on this fantasy nonsense. Do you know how many people try to become writers? Do you understand the statistics? You're setting yourself up for disappointment, and frankly, it's painful to watch." These conversations always followed the same pattern. Tyler would present his case with the logical precision of a financial analyst, pointing out my lack of health insurance, my inability to afford a car newer than 2010, my studio apartment in a neighborhood he considered sketchy. I would defend my choices while secretly wondering if he was right. If I was just an overgrown child, clinging to unrealistic dreams while real adults built careers and retirement accounts. The worst part was that Tyler genuinely believed he was helping me. His criticism came from a place of love, wrapped in concern about my future and frustration with what he saw as my stubborn refusal to face reality. He'd achieved everything our parents had hoped for in a child: financial success, professional respect, a clear trajectory toward the American dream of upward mobility. From his perspective, my insistence on pursuing writing looked like self-sabotage. What Tyler couldn't understand was that writing wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. The stories that lived in my imagination weren't escapism from real life. They were the most real thing about me. Every rejection letter from publishers, every month when I had to choose between groceries and electricity, every family gathering where I felt like a disappointment, it all felt worth it when I was lost in the world I'd created, when characters I'd brought to life were facing challenges that mattered to me more than quarterly profit reports ever could. The invitation to Tyler's company holiday party arrived via text message 3 weeks before Christmas, delivered with his characteristic blend of obligation and condescension. Morrison and Associates annual party this Saturday. Black tie optional. Mom says I have to invite you. Try to dress appropriately, and please don't talk about your book to my colleagues. This is important for my career. I stared at the message while standing behind the espresso machine at Grind Coffee, steam wand hissing in the background as a line of caffeine-dependent Portlanders waited for their morning fuel. The fact that Tyler felt compelled to warn me against discussing my writing told me everything I needed to know about how he planned to introduce me to his professional world, as the quirky little sister with impractical dreams who needed to be managed like a potential embarrassment. The party was being held at the Columbia River Gorge Hotel, a historic venue that screamed old money and established success. I'd spent my last discretionary $40 on a black dress from a consignment shop, hoping it would pass for appropriate in a crowd where women wore jewelry that cost more than my annual rent. The dress fit well enough, but standing in the marble-columned lobby surrounded by Portland's financial elite, I felt like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. Tyler found me near the cocktail table, looking polished and confident in his tailored tuxedo, a crystal tumbler of expensive whiskey in his hand. "Sienna, you made it," he said. His smile warm, but his eyes already scanning the room for more important people to talk to. "Come on, let me introduce you to some people." The way he said it suggested he was about to present a mildly interesting museum exhibit rather than his sister. The first group included several junior analysts and their spouses, pleasant enough people who made polite conversation about Portland's restaurant scene and weekend hiking spots. Tyler managed the introductions smoothly, describing me as my sister who lives in Southeast Portland, without mentioning what I actually did for work. When someone asked about my job, Tyler jumped in before I could answer. "Sienna's between careers right now, figuring out her next move." The humiliation started gradually, building momentum as Tyler's confidence grew with each cocktail. By the time we'd moved to the main ballroom, he'd found his rhythm and his audience. Anthony Mason's inner circle of senior executives, people whose approval could advance or derail careers with a casual comment. This was Tyler's chance to shine, and he wasn't going to let his eccentric sister's presence dim his spotlight. "You know, it's funny having a creative in the family," Tyler announced to the group, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused tolerance that made my stomach clench. "Sienna here has been working on this fantasy novel for years. Dragons, magic, sword fights, the whole 9 yards. She's absolutely convinced it's going to be published someday." The group chuckled politely, the kind of laughter that happens when someone's clearly building toward a punchline. Anthony Mason stood at the edge of the circle, listening with what I assumed was polite interest as Tyler continued his performance. "Don't get me wrong, I admire her dedication," Tyler said, gesturing toward me with his whiskey glass. "But at some point, you have to face reality, right? She's 28 years old, working at a coffee shop, living in a studio apartment that's basically a closet with a window. Meanwhile, she spends every free moment writing about imaginary worlds instead of building a real career." The circle had grown larger now, drawn by Tyler's animated storytelling and the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. "I keep telling her she should consider marketing or maybe teaching," Tyler continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. "She's got great communication skills, she's smart, but this writing thing is just a dead-end hobby. It's time to grow up and join the real world where people actually pay you for your work." Someone in the group asked what my book was about, and Tyler answered before I could speak. "Oh, it's this elaborate fantasy epic with kingdoms and prophecies and chosen heroes. Basically Lord of the Rings meets Game of Thrones, but written by someone who's never been published and has no idea how the industry actually works." The laughter was louder this time, more genuine, as Tyler successfully positioned himself as the practical older brother dealing with a delusional sibling. I stood there feeling my face burn with embarrassment, wanting to defend myself but knowing that anything I said would only fuel Tyler's narrative about my unrealistic expectations and childish dreams. The call from Lisa Johnson had come at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was hunched over my laptop at a corner table in Grind Coffee, editing a romance manuscript about a vampire CEO and trying to ignore the growing pile of bills on my kitchen counter at home. Lisa's number had been stored in my phone for 2 years, ever since she'd agreed to represent me after reading the first 50 pages of my manuscript at a writers' conference in Seattle. For 24 months, she'd been submitting my trilogy to publishers and collecting rejection letters with the patience of someone who understood that the publishing industry moved at the speed of continental drift. "Sienna, please tell me you're sitting down." Lisa's voice crackled through my ancient iPhone, carrying an excitement that made my heart race before my brain could process why. "I need you to sit down right now because what I'm about to tell you is going to change everything." I'd been through enough false alarms and near misses to temper my expectations, but something in Lisa's tone was different this time, electric with the kind of barely contained energy that comes from delivering life-changing news. "Penguin Random House wants your trilogy," she said, the words hitting me like a physical force that made me grip the edge of the coffee shop table to steady myself. "Not just one book, Sienna. All 3. They want to publish the Chronicles of Valdresses as a major fantasy series, and they're talking about a marketing campaign that includes bookstore displays, online promotion, and possible film rights down the line." The coffee shop noise faded into background static as Lisa's words rewrote my understanding of what was possible. The numbers she rattled off sounded like fantasy themselves. A $200,000 advance split across 3 books, with escalating royalty percentages and international distribution rights. "They want to fast-track publication for next spring," Lisa continued, her voice still bubbling with excitement. "Apparently, there's a senior editor there named David Kim who's been championing your work internally for months. He's convinced that epic fantasy is having a resurgence, and he wants your trilogy to be part of the wave." I sat in that coffee shop chair, surrounded by the familiar sounds of espresso machines and indie folk music, trying to process the fact that my life had just fundamentally changed in the span of a 5-minute phone call. The same manuscript that had been collecting rejection letters for 2 years, the story that Tyler dismissed as escapist nonsense, was about to become a published novel distributed to bookstores across the country and beyond. "Lisa, are you absolutely certain this is real?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I glanced around the coffee shop to make sure no one could hear me having what felt like a fever dream. "Because I've been living on ramen noodles and hope for so long that I'm not sure I can handle another disappointment." Lisa's laughter was warm and reassuring, the sound of someone who'd been through this process enough times to recognize the genuine article. "Sienna, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I'm telling you this is as real as it gets," she said. "The contracts are being drawn up as we speak. You're going to be a published author with a major house, and from what I'm hearing through industry channels, they're planning to position your series as their big fantasy debut for next year." The reality of it was starting to sink in, bringing with it a mixture of euphoria and terror that made my hands shake as I gripped the phone. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. Tyler's company party was just 4 hours away, an event I'd been dreading because I knew it would involve more lectures about practical career choices and realistic expectations. I'd planned to smile politely through another evening of feeling like the family disappointment, the dreamer who refused to grow up and join the real world of responsible adults with stable jobs and retirement plans. Now I was sitting with the knowledge that everything Tyler had said about my dead-end hobby was about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The world I'd created in my imagination, the characters he'd dismissed as childish escapism, were about to become books that people could buy in stores. Stories that might touch other dreamers who felt like outsiders in a world that valued practical achievements over creative passion. But I didn't tell him. Something held me back from sharing the news, maybe because I'd grown so accustomed to his skepticism that I wanted to savor this victory privately before subjecting it to analysis and criticism. The transformation of Tyler's expression was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. The way his confident smile froze mid-sentence, then slowly melted into confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of stunned recognition that his entire understanding of reality had just been turned upside down. Anthony Mason stood before us holding my unpublished manuscript like it was a sacred text, his eyes bright with genuine enthusiasm as he continued praising work that Tyler had been mocking just moments before. "Miss Walsh, I have to confess something," Anthony said, seemingly oblivious to the shocked silence that had fallen over our group. "I've been following your writing blog for months, ever since my assistant accidentally forwarded me one of your world-building posts instead of a quarterly report. I was so impressed by your attention to detail and narrative structure that I started reading everything you'd published online." He held up the manuscript with reverence, as if it were a first-edition Tolkien rather than a printout from my home computer. Tyler's mouth was opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, his usual eloquence completely abandoned as he tried to process what he was witnessing. The senior executives who had been laughing at his stories about my delusional writing career were now staring at me with newfound interest, recalibrating their understanding of who I was and why their boss was treating me like a celebrity. "Mr. Mason," I managed to say, my voice still shaky from the surreal nature of the situation, "how did you get a copy of my manuscript?" "It hasn't been published yet." The question had been nagging at me since the moment he'd appeared with the book, because I'd only sent the completed trilogy to Lisa and a handful of beta readers who'd signed strict confidentiality agreements. Anthony's smile widened with the satisfaction of someone about to reveal a particularly delicious secret. "My daughter Chloe works as an editorial assistant at Penguin Random House. She's been raving about this fantasy trilogy that's supposed to revolutionize the genre, and when she mentioned the author's name, I realized it was the same Sienna Walsh whose blog posts I'd been reading religiously." He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "She smuggled me an advance copy because she knows I'm a massive fantasy fan. Between you and me, I haven't been this excited about a new series since I discovered Brandon Sanderson." The revelation hit Tyler like a physical blow. His sister, the one he'd been publicly humiliating for having unrealistic dreams, was not only about to be published by one of the biggest houses in the world, but had somehow impressed his billionaire boss enough that said boss was carrying around bootleg copies of her work and praising it to anyone who would listen. "Wait," Tyler said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to regain his footing in a conversation that had completely escaped his control. "Sienna, what's he talking about? What's this about Penguin Random House?" The color had drained from his face as the implications of Anthony's words began to sink in, and I could see him rapidly recalculating everything he thought he knew about my life and career prospects. "I was planning to tell you later," I said, pulling out my phone to show him the text messages from Lisa that I'd been saving like treasure. "Lisa called this afternoon. They want all 3 books, Tyler. $200,000, major marketing campaign, international distribution. Everything you said was impossible? It's happening." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like speaking a foreign language I'd just learned. Anthony Mason began applauding, which prompted the rest of the group to join in with enthusiastic clapping that drew attention from across the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Anthony announced to the growing crowd, "we have a genuine literary celebrity in our midst. Sienna Walsh is about to become one of the most important fantasy authors of her generation, and we're witnessing the beginning of what I predict will be an extraordinary career." Tyler stood frozen in the center of the celebrating crowd, his expensive tuxedo and polished confidence suddenly looking like costume pieces from a play he no longer understood. The brother who had spent years lecturing me about realistic expectations and practical career choices was watching his boss ask for my autograph while praising the very dreams he'd been calling childish and unrealistic. "Would you mind signing this for me?" Anthony asked, producing a gold pen from his jacket pocket. "And perhaps you could make it out to Chloe as well. She's going to be absolutely thrilled when I tell her I met you." 6 months later, I stood in Powell's Books on Burnside Street, staring at a display table featuring my novel alongside bestsellers by authors I'd idolized for years. The Chronicles of Valdres, Book 1. The Awakening sat in a neat stack beneath a hand-lettered sign reading, Local Author Spotlight, and every few minutes, someone would pick up a copy, flip through the pages, and either add it to their purchase pile or reluctantly set it back down. Each sale felt like a small miracle. Validation for every rejection letter, every family gathering where I'd felt like a disappointment, every moment of doubt about whether I was wasting my life chasing an impossible dream. The book launch had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. Lisa had been right about the resurgence of epic fantasy. Readers were hungry for new worlds and complex characters, and early reviews were comparing my work to genre legends while praising my fresh voice and innovative approach to classical themes. The advance copies had generated buzz on social media. Fantasy book bloggers were calling it the debut of the year, and Penguin Random House had already fast-tracked production on the second book to meet demand. Tyler had undergone his own transformation during those 6 months, though his journey toward understanding had been more gradual and painful than mine toward success. The night of the company party, after Anthony Mason had finished gushing about my work and asking detailed questions about my writing process, Tyler had driven me home in silence, his BMW cutting through Portland's rain-slicked streets while he processed the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about his little sister's life. "I owe you an apology," he'd finally said as we sat in his car outside my apartment building, his voice quiet and strangely vulnerable. "Not just for tonight, but for years of making you feel like your dreams were worthless. I was so focused on what I thought success looked like that I couldn't see what you were actually building." It was the first time in our adult relationship that Tyler had admitted to being wrong about something that mattered, and the sincerity in his voice had brought tears to my eyes. The changes in our relationship had been profound and surprising. Tyler had become my biggest champion, buying copies of my book for friends and colleagues, posting enthusiastic reviews on his social media accounts, and calling me regularly to check on my progress with the sequel. The brother who had once urged me to abandon writing for marketing had transformed into someone who understood that creative work was every bit as valid and valuable as corporate achievement. "I think I was jealous," he'd confessed during one of our coffee dates a few months after the book launch. "You were brave enough to pursue something you were passionate about, even when it seemed impossible. I took the safe path, the one everyone expected, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself that meant I was smarter or more mature. But watching you succeed at something you truly love made me realize I've never taken a real risk in my life." The success had brought changes beyond just our family dynamics. I'd been able to quit my job at Grind Coffee, though I still visited regularly to write and catch up with my former coworkers. The studio apartment had been replaced with a small house in the Alberta Arts District, complete with a dedicated writing office and enough space for the extensive fantasy library I'd always dreamed of building. Financial security felt surreal after years of choosing between groceries and electricity, but the real gift was time, the ability to write without worrying about rent money or health insurance. Anthony Mason had become an unexpected mentor and friend, inviting me to speak at his company's leadership retreats about creativity, persistence, and the value of pursuing unconventional paths. His daughter Chloe had become my unofficial publicist at Penguin Random House, connecting me with other debut authors and helping navigate the complex world of publishing marketing. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the letters from readers, emails from young writers who felt inspired by my story, messages from people who'd felt like outsiders or dreamers in practical worlds and found hope in my journey from coffee shop barista to published author. These connections reminded me why I'd started writing in the first place, not for fame or money, but to create stories that mattered to people who needed them. The lesson wasn't just about following dreams or proving doubters wrong. It was about understanding that there are many different ways to build a meaningful life, and success looks different for everyone. Sometimes the people who love us most are also the ones who struggle to see our potential, not because they don't care, but because they're afraid of watching us fail. And sometimes the dreams that seem most impossible are simply waiting for the right moment to become reality.